Well, Netflix dropped its fifth season of hit F1 series, Drive to Survive, and both myself and a panel of DTS fans are going to sit down and take a look at some of the insights and stories that emerged from the series. I'm your host, Jonathan Simon, but my friends call me Jonathan Simon, and we've assembled a panel of expert fans to help me out, starting with Matt Trumpets. Matt, how's it going?
I applaud your mediocre effort at my name. And sleep. Who needs sleep with Netflix?
Well, you, Matt, binge Drive to Survive with the wife this time.
Yeah, I did. So it didn't really just turn into an all-nighter because she goes to bed at like 9 o'clock. But you'll probably find that out later.
And PR guru Chris Stevens also joins us. Chris, how's it going?
Yeah, hey Jono, I'm doing good. I've finally recovered after losing an entire weekend to binging a Netflix show.
Nothing new, nothing new. How did you find this series? It seemed to be one of your favorites.
Yeah, I've already said this on the show on Sunday, and I've tweeted about it as well. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I thought it was one of the best, if not the best, series they've done.
Yes, and of course, expert sim racer and streamer Scott Tuffey returns to the podcast. What's been happening, Scott?
Hey, Jonathan. Thanks for having me back. Yeah, like the others, binge watched with the missus Netflix Drive to Survive over the weekend. Yes, getting hyped for the new season ahead.
Well, that's another one because I can also say I also binge watched the series with the missus too. So let's take a look at some of the news and stories emerging from Drive to Survive.
Big Dirty News.
So there were a lot of stories that came out of Drive to Survive this year. One of the most fascinating ones was, of course, the old team principal battle, Toto Wolff versus Christian Horner. And then you throw in Mattia Binotto in there too, just add a little bit of salt and pepper and spice to the action. The biggest story behind this, well, there were two. You start with not only the porpoising, but the cost cap as well. And that's where these three team principals pounced. About the porpoising, and that was the first one that came out in the series. There was a nice little, I don't want to say nice, but it was a very, very heated discussion, a big team owners meeting where Toto Wolff is sort of being, I don't want to say gaslighted, but sort of ganged up on between Christian Horner and Mattia Binotto. Who do we start with this, Matt? You seem to agree with Horner and Binotto on the porpoising side, where Mercedes were struggling with the bouncing. Toto's basically saying, look, the rules are terrible. They need to be changed. Whereas the other two team bosses are going, well, mate, you've stuffed up with your car. You need to change it.
Yeah, and I just want to say for our listeners, heated is the word we use when we can't use stronger words because we are safe for work. I agreed with them in this very, very strict context of the conversation. Because Wolff was saying, oh, what if our car crashes because blah, blah, blah. And they basically made the point, well, look, it's your car. You should probably change it so that it doesn't crash. But I feel like there was definitely a lot of missing context to this discussion. So while I agreed with Horner in the immediacy of that scene, and I think he was absolutely correct, there's a wider context to it that I think gives a lot of weight to where Wolff was coming from.
Chris?
I live for moments like this. These little fly on the wall moments of the series are what make Drive to Survive viewable for fans like us who have been watching it for a very long time. And the two incidents that we're talking about here, the porpoising and the cost cap, just goes to show, for me anyway, that a team principal, no matter what their previous history, will always play the victim when things are against them and tell everyone it's their own problem when they've got it sorted. They will happily play both sides of the coin, and that's exactly what Christian Horner did when he was saying that's your problem with the porpoising and suddenly playing the victim when it came to the cost cap.
And that's exactly what I thought as well, was both sides in this situation I felt were correct. So you had Toto going, well, look, this is dangerous and the rules need to be changed. But at the same time, every other team managed to avoid the porpoising dilemma. And this is this situation, Scott, where the cars, one side of the cars were bouncing a lot. You've had Lewis Hamilton and George Russell saying, hey, I've got back issues at Azerbaijan. And the other team's going, well, we're porpoising, but we're quick. And you guys suck. And you guys have won the last however many championships for 7 years. We're just going to see you suffer and basically throw salt on the wound.
Most definitely. And Mercedes were quite clearly the worst car for porpoising last year. And Toto was going to try everything that he could to gain as much of an advantage that he could in regards to hopefully getting the regulations changed. But what I thought was brilliant was Christian Horner asking, is this for the cameras? Do we need to do this in front of them? He knew exactly what he was saying, and he wanted every single moment of that captured on camera because that was his moment to shine. And even Gunther got in and ganged up upon on Toto, which I don't think we've seen too much of in any season of Drive to Survive.
Well, I think his "is this for the cameras" is exactly, as you said, what he wanted, because he excels in that kind of immediate, witty repartee, put down contest. I mean, that's like his wheelhouse. But for context, I mean, I know you say that Mercedes, the other teams had not solved porpoising at all. If you looked at the Ferraris, particularly in the braking zone, it was terrifying, even though they seemed to be able to manage it. The Wolf's larger point, which I do believe was absolutely correct, was that, like, look, we need to protect the drivers from these kinds of forces. And it's long been a thing in Formula One. I mean, we can go all the way back to the active suspension on the Williams. On the Lotus, when they put active suspension on, they were concerned with the driver's ability to drive. Williams was like, oh, the drivers are paid to take this punishment. All we care about is making car go fast. And I think that's the point Wolf was making. Like, we need to put limits in to protect the drivers, because if we don't, then they will get in anything and try and drive it fast.
Chris, obviously active suspension was a little bit before our time in Formula One. We're still avid fans, so we kind of know all about that. That was in the early 90s, but it is a very similar situation in this one. The thing I found fascinating was how heated these sort of team principal, what do you call them, meetings go on with the FIA, and how intriguing it was to step in. And we've had this in the past where they'll put a camera in a driver's briefing meeting, and it's one of the most fascinating 2-3 minutes out there on YouTube. Yeah,
they did it on the F1 channel for a while, didn't they? Which I thought was fantastic. And yeah, more peeks behind the curtain like that. But, talking about is Toto playing up to the cameras, or Christian playing up to the cameras by asking Toto if he's playing up to the cameras? Of course, the irony is they're both playing up to the cameras. They're both taking advantage of this opportunity that they know this is going to get broadcast to millions of people. So they're both playing on that role, but coming from very different sides, obviously.
I thought what was quite intriguing about that meeting as well is that Stefano Domenicali, and I can't remember who was sitting to his right, but he was like a head teacher. He scolded Gunther Steiner for talking and to basically be quiet. And they all did. And it was very interesting to see the team principals in that position, because we don't. And then, of course, the following conversation was like a bunch of kids having a disagreement in secondary school. But yeah, Toto obviously got very irate and very defensive, even threatening to go after team principals if, of course, there was going to be a crash due to porpoising, trying every ammunition that he had.
Well, of course, contextually to this conversation, porpoising was still an issue on a number of cars. It wasn't just the Mercedes at this point, but it didn't seem to be a major issue on a lot of the other cars. Like, no one else was complaining about back problems or it being a safety concern. And maybe that is an extreme angle that Mercedes took to try and get the regs changed and to play it in their favor a little bit.
And Matt, along with that too, I mean, yeah, Mercedes did suffer the worst, and they seem to be the most public about their issues with the car. And that's why Toto's come in and gone, hey, look, we need to stick up for ourselves and become competitive again. Do you think it was true where Toto's gone, this is a safety issue, we need to change it? Or do you think he's sort of trying to convince people to change the rules to make Mercedes quick again? That's another good context there.
I think the answer to your question is yes. So is there a legitimate safety concern? Well, I would say that I think that there is, and that we know that there is, not because any particular rule was changed, but because the FIA have developed a sensor to measure this angular momentum and set a limit for drivers. And so the parallel I want to draw is to, say, the NFL, National Football League over here in America, where after years of playing football, they're finding these neurological problems that they think are caused by these impacts. These impacts can be essentially rated as a certain amount of G against your head. So if you're a driver bouncing up and down, you have a lot of, you're bouncing your brain up and down. So yeah, there's a potential that there's a long-term health impact on drivers here, and it's worthy of being studied, and it's worthy of being limited in the interest of protecting driver safety. That said, it's also very convenient for Mercedes that any fix to this problem or any limit to this problem is probably going to help them more relative to their rivals than it will help their rivals themselves.
And on that front, it came to the cost cap dilemma where you switch the sides of who's playing victim now. Mercedes no longer the victims in this one. Were the victims Red Bull, or were they the perpetrators? That's the next question there. The cost cap dilemma we had was we got a lot of insight into sort of how public a lot of the teams were. This is back in the real world before Drive to Survive. You had Zach Brown's letter. You had Toto Wolff being unashamedly accusing Red Bull of doing this and doing that over the budget to try and get themselves a championship. But who wants to go with this one? Chris, I'll go with you first. So this is a situation where Red Bull have exceeded the cost cap by, what was it, like 400,000 or a few million. And at the end of the day, Christian Horner this time was playing the victim, going, hey, look, it's only a small amount of money. It's not going to make that big of a difference. Well, that was a very intriguing insight to see how passionate he was about making himself a victim in this one.
Yeah, because they doubled down on the idea that they'd done absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever, even though it was very much proven that they had. And it astounded me that Christian Horner came across that he was surprised that they got a negative reaction about that, and that they were not a popular team for breaking the cost cap, as if we're going to turn around and say, oh, it's okay, Red Bull, what's 400 grand between friends, you go along, it'll be absolutely fine. And for him to then hide as well behind the language that he was using, which was very, very carefully chosen. We did not cheat, i.e. because we didn't do it deliberately. Does not matter. And then to also play the mental health card as well, as a oh, stop bullying us, you're being really mean. They're like, oh my God, I thought the whole thing was just a bit pathetic.
And I think that's also been exampled by, we said we've watched it with our partners, and my girlfriend was sitting there going, why is he playing the victim when he's broken the rules and he's the only team to have broken the rules? And I was just sitting there shaking my head, because this is exactly the same thing I've said throughout the season when this was all announced. But it was very intriguing to see how much of the victim he was still playing behind closed doors. He really didn't see that he had done something wrong. And you could see how much he was sweating, even approaching Mattia Bonotto on the Singapore Grand Prix grid. Of course, this was before I think it was officially announced they'd breached the cost cap. But he was clearly very paranoid and very upset with these rumours. But he must have known that they were very close to the cost cap limit.
Yeah, I actually quite enjoyed that as well when you went to the grid and Matthias said, well, look, I didn't mention your team specifically. I said any team. So if you want to play the victim there, maybe you're guilty. And that was a very, very savage sort of mental game that Mattia Bonotto was playing. And Matt, obviously, mental health in this situation, of course, Horn has said, look, like this has affected us and everything. We still have to take him seriously in that context too.
Yeah, no, I mean, mental health is absolutely no joke, especially in the post-COVID era. However, using mental health as a shield against your wrongdoing is also just not really on, to borrow a British phrase. My wife picked up on his language straight away. She was like, oh, and I use her because it was fun to watch with someone who wasn't as devoted to the utter minutia of Formula One as I am. And she absolutely despised him playing victim. And I agree. The funny thing to me is not that they did this, because I think, frankly, Aston Martin did it. Williams messed it up too. They were not the only ones to dance around the edges of this regulation. But the simple fact that, and I think it was the Otmar quote said, yeah, look, if we're half a millimeter off in the technical regulations, our car gets disqualified. Aston Martin in Hungary 2 years ago, they didn't have quite enough fuel, disqualified. They finished in second place. So if you spend too much money, whether intentionally or not, there is a penalty that should follow. It's just very basic. But the fact that they played the victim, it was like the Streisand effect. It just poured immense amounts of fuel onto that fire, where if they stood up and said, look, you know what? It's possible we made a mistake here. We didn't intend to do this. We're going to talk to the FIA. We're going to look at what happened. We're going to make sure this never happens again. Everybody would have been like, well, whatever.
And of course, the TV sort of producers will pick a certain angle to go with on all this. So that's also sort of doesn't help Horner's context in this kind of sense and kind of his sort of perception on this whole dilemma and how we perceive him. But the thing I've noticed the most coming out of Drive to Survive, right, Scott, is there's a couple people in F1 who have big obsessions. Number one is got to be Nico Rosberg. If you have a big bingo card of 5 Lewis Hamiltons in a row, you would cross that off in the first 5 conversations you have with him. Second most I've noticed is Christian Horner. He seems to go after Mercedes, Scott, almost every single time he's on the show. And he seems to have this kind of obsession to attack them in the media. And Max is the same. And it brings memories of that 2021 battle back in the past where they were doing the same and Mercedes were kind of trying to shrug it off.
Yeah, there was a scene that I think kind of got glossed over. It was only a few seconds where Christian Horner was talking to Max in the pit box, and he went over and discussed with Max about these rumors. This was at the Singapore Grand Prix, about these rumors that they'd supposedly broken the cost cap, and was blaming Mercedes and Toto Wolff for it. Now, it's like he was seeking validation from Max, and Max said, oh, it's just them trying to discredit us for last year, doing whatever they can. But yeah, pretty much every opportunity he likes to mention that they dominated the sport for 7 odd years, 8 years. And to be honest, if I was Toto Wolff, I'd be saying thank you to Christian Horner, because you're just going to keep reminding everyone how good we were for 8 years.
Well, on that front as well, you can put yourself in Red Bull's shoes and kind of understand where they're coming from on all this. You go, hey, look, we've won a championship. Don't take it away from us. What's 400 grand going to do in this situation? And to be honest, they can sort of be correct as well if you think about it. It's not that big of a difference. The fascination I found from the whole sort of what came out of Drive to Survive was, and who I really respect a lot after this is Zach Brown. And with him talking about the letter he sent to sort of the FIA, I think it was to the FIA, or was it to the teams, or it was an official letter of sort of saying, hey, look, once you cross the line, this is against the rules. And Scott, on that one, Zach Brown was very well spoken and explained, hey, look, this isn't personal. I don't hate Christian. I don't hate Red Bull. I don't want to, do anything like that. But also we need to stick up for ourselves and the rules, because the cost cap needs to be adhered to. This is for the success of the future of the sport.
Yeah, I think the exact words he used, it was essential for the integrity of the sport. And I think most like-minded fans are of that same mind as well. And he made a quote about Christian Horner, which I think summed him up quite aptly. He can dish it out, but he can't take it. And that's kind of what I took from this particular cost cap episode.
Anyone on that, Matt?
Well, yeah, I would agree with that. The thing that it fascinates me most is in the arguing for a little or no penalty is how much, and again, I'm going to reference watching with my wife. She was, because we had our conversations about what a correct penalty would be. The FIA made their decision. My wife was like, they shouldn't have a constructors championship. They spent too much money. There's no way they should be eligible for that if they spent too much money, period, end of. And I was, well, kind of surprised actually that was her take. And I'm just curious where everybody else came down on that after seeing him in this context.
Well, it wasn't the only sense of drama in the paddock, of course. Let's go down the grid a little bit and let's speak about Alpine, because they had a couple of drivers set in stone. Fernando Alonso, Esteban Ocon. They had El Plan or whatever it was. I can't even remember what it was called now. It's been so long ago, for Fernando Alonso to win a world championship in that car. And then this whole domino effect happened. Sebastian Vettel retires. Alonso takes his seat at Aston Martin. And then it leads to Oscar Piastri not signing with Alpine and moving to McLaren. The first thing I took out of this, Chris, was Vettel's retired. And of course, Alonso stepped into his Aston Martin seat. We got some intriguing looks into the conversations surrounding that and how Fernando Alonso said, I think it was at Hungary, said, hey, look, I'm happy to talk. I need this contract soon. Next thing you know, Lawrence Stroll has offered up what seemed like the big bucks, is what I took from that conversation.
Yeah, 100%. And what that episode did for me was reaffirm my previous belief that Alpine really dropped the ball with the whole Alonso Piastri situation. And Otmar can keep going on about loyalty when it comes to Oscar Piastri, but the truth behind it was he was going to re-sign Fernando before he left. So what else was Oscar going to do? And for me, yeah, it was all of Alpine's own doing.
And that's a very good point as well, actually, when you think about it that way, is that, yeah, look, Alpine were looking to keep Alonso. They were going to keep Ocon. He signed what was like, I think it's like a 15-year deal they signed him on. It was a very long
72.
deal. 70, yeah. It was a very, very long deal for Esteban Ocon. But then what happens to Oscar, Matt? Where does he go? And so in the context of that and seeing that conversation of them trying to re-sign Alonso, I all of a sudden don't feel like Oscar did anything wrong in this situation.
Well, you ask the rather pertinent question, what happens to Piastri if Alonso is signed? And the answer is he goes to Williams to replace George Russell, who's now at Mercedes. Here's what it is. Either the timing of it, because the Alonso deal wasn't done and Alpine wanted Piastri for Alpine, if Alonso was going to bolt on them, which given his history was not an impossibility. I think he got impatient, looked at how McLaren was doing and said, oh, that looks like a great place to go drive a car. And his lawyers looked at his lack of a contract and said, oh, geez, you know what? We could actually make that happen if you really want it. And I think that was probably the start of it. But yeah, he would have gone to Williams, done a season or two, and wound up at Alpine had Alonso stayed.
And that really impressed me, though, about Otmar Zafnauer is, look, this new team boss who's come from the Force India days into the Racing Points, into the Aston Martin, has made the most out of an efficient budget. He's had this whole sort of reputation built around him where, look, he can take a midfield team and score a lot of points and be up there competing for, the high end of the points, not potentially wins or podiums, but can do a lot with a small budget. He goes over to Aston Martin. And in this sense, he's sort of left the team and he's brought in context to say, hey, look, this new owner, Lawrence Stroll, he's not sort of easy to work with. It's a lot of pressure. And the sort of insights they gave behind that, Chris, was sort of, hey, look, Lawrence Stroll is not as easygoing as an owner that I wanted to work with.
Yeah, and I think that provides a lot of good context for Fernando's move and what he might have to deal with in his with his new team this year. But it goes back to what we were saying earlier, wasn't it, about playing the victim? Otmar was playing the victim because his driver decided to go somewhere else because they weren't giving him a race seat. Yes, there was potentially the option for him to go to Williams if there was no seat at Alpine, but was there any guarantee that that was going to happen? Because we know that Williams had a few options on the board to partner Albon after getting rid of Latifi. So I don't think that Oscar did anything wrong. I didn't at the time, and I still don't think that, having heard a bit more from Otmar's perspective.
And actually on that, Scott, is the fact that Piastri wasn't painted well in the media after all this drama. You know, it's somebody who's coming into the sport, trying to make a name for yourself, and now off track is sort of costing your reputation a lot. But in this sense, I feel like it's almost a little bit repaired.
Yeah, I think what the Netflix show didn't show is the nuances in the contracts. For most of us who listen to this podcast will probably know the details that happened with Alpine and Piastri, and that there was complications and misunderstandings with contracts. That Netflix didn't display that. So I think that's why maybe it might have looked like that he come off as the baddie. But most of all, it just looked like overall misunderstanding from Otmar, and McLaren took advantage of that. Clearly, Mark Webber, although he was only in it for a short period, was labelled as Piastri's manager, clearly was doing work in the background to do what was best for his driver after they clearly was going to go for the Fernando Alonso route. But what was brilliant, I think, is there was, once again, just another little snippet that I picked up, was that Fernando Alonso was walking down the pit lane, and they went, "What have you started in regards to silly season?" And he went, "Not me, Sebastian Vettel."
Well, that's actually true, Matt. If you think about it, like I said, Vettel started the domino effect with all this, with his retirement, and he caused a whole drama, and one of the best silly seasons I think we witnessed in Formula One for quite some time.
Oh, yeah, it was delightful. It gave us so much to argue about. I do want to speak up briefly in defense of Otmar there. I mean, he was at Aston Martin until the start of this season. I'm fairly sure maybe you could ding him for not looking over the legal contracts that were supposed to have been signed. But I'm going to point at like whatever lawyers were actually in charge of that as being a major provider of all this drama. That said, they did spend an awful lot on Piastri in the meantime, letting him drive old Formula One cars around circuits and giving him coaching and stuff like that. So I think their point that they invested a lot in him, and it's not a massive step to say, look, if we're going to give you a seat at Williams, just trust us. Well, once you've spent $4 million on me, I might be slightly more inclined to trust you. Although, to be fair, Formula One, it is a tank of piranhas.
Not only that, but I think that's a good way to put it, actually. Otmar Zafnauer is a very, like I said, he's an efficient team principal, an efficient team owner. So I was actually surprised he wanted to bring Fernando Alonso back for another year. As good as of a talent as Fernando is, Chris, it's never been sort of the guy that Otmar, I feel like, would go for. And I almost feel like now with the driver lineup he's got this year with Gasly and Ocon, it's almost better for the team and better for what Otmar wants out of a team.
Maybe, but if Otmar wanted return on investment in Piastri, he should have given him a seat sooner. Because him already spending a year on the sidelines after winning Formula Renault, Formula 3 and Formula 2 titles in back-to-back years is an atrocity. He should have been in Formula 1 straight away. The idea that he was then going to get his entry-level seat after that as well is just, it's a bit of a slap in the face, really.
And people accuse Drive to Survive of dramatizing things. Oh my goodness. He got loads of experience working with Alpine. He got drives in Formula One cars. He got coaching. It's like, it's nice when all the cards line up and your little champion can go and join Formula One immediately, but he would hardly be the first driver who had to sit out one, or if you're Nick DeVries, multiple seasons.
Okay.
Before you get your drive. And
There is a difference between Nick de Vries and Oscar Piastri. I am telling you. De Vries was not Formula One ready when he won the F2 title. No one has had a junior career like Oscar Piastri has had. You don't just keep him on the sidelines for a year, and you certainly can't compare him to the other drivers that have had to sit on the sidelines for a year.
No one. So you don't think Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen's had a great junior career like Oscar Piastri has?
I'm not saying no one had a great junior career, but no one has done what he did, winning back to back titles like he did.
That's true. That is very true. Even I think Lewis Hamilton took 2 years of F3 to win that title, then won GP2 his first year, which I always say, and my fundamental rule, Scott, is if you can win GP2, or Formula 2 now, which is it's called, if you can win that in your first season, I think you're a generational talent. And everyone's proved that, except Nico Hulkenberg.
Yeah, that's so true.
Who knows? Maybe he'll get his first podium this year. But speaking of drama and how truthful of a scenario this is, who knows? But we was discussing the conversations that Otmar and Zach Brown had, which is why I think I gained a lot of respect for Otmar. I have always not really thought too much of him, to be honest, but how set up that conversation was, I think Netflix did really well in capturing a load of candid conversations this season. And yeah, there was a couple of conversations captured between them regarding the Piastri scenario, vice versa, going into each other's homes, mobile homes, which I suppose takes a little bit of confidence, to say the least. But I thought that was very intriguing. How put on it was, who knows? But it was intriguing to see both of them go at it over the scenario. And Zach Brown, him actually firing back at Otmar in regards to the fact of, well, this will be a PR disaster for you, and don't try to drag us into this. It was intriguing.
The team principal fights were certainly very intriguing in Drive to Survive. One thing I was very fascinated by was Zach Brown saying, hey, a driver swap is fair with Ricciardo and Piastri. That's not fair at all. I don't know what he was talking about in that sense. Was it Ricciardo and Piastri, I think? Was it there, Matt? Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Those two. That is not fair at all. Come on, Zach. Do you really think that was a good thing? Piastri's had one of the best junior careers of all time, which is what Chris said. No, I'm just kidding, Chris. It's all good. One of the next big topics that we're going to go to is the Mick Schumacher-Haas relationship. This was, I don't want to say tumultuous, but just not a good fit for either of the groups. You look at Haas number one, and they, in this sort of context, need a reliable driver, an experienced driver who can score points. They're a team who don't have much of a budget. Every single crash, every single mistake costs them money. You've got a frugal team boss of Gunther Steiner, and maybe frugal is a bad way to put him because he has to work with the money that he's given. And he doesn't have all the money in the world. And so he has to be like, hey, we need to save as much money as possible. And then you have an inexperienced sort of young, no longer a rookie, but a young driver in Mick Schumacher who's been crashing a lot, who's been making mistakes, and who's been sort of costing the team millions of dollars. His crash at Monaco, he's had crashes at other circuits too. Who wants to go on this first? Matt, Mick Schumacher and Haas, did we find out that this was a good fit for them after Drive to Survive, or was this a terrible fit for both people?
Yeah, so let's be clear. This was always the wrong shoe on the wrong foot for Haas. Their entire stated method of working was to harvest veteran drivers because, as we have seen, experience is worth a lot more now than natural raw talent in this particular regulation set we find ourselves in. So their way of working was to get cheap veteran drivers who might otherwise have been kicked out of the sport and take advantage of them, along with buying everything they can from Ferrari and just being a little bit clever on their own. Worked really well for them, for the most part, until everybody's favorite F1 sponsor, Rich Energy, stranded them without money. And subsequently, they get rid of their veteran drivers, both Magnussen and Grosjean, and they bring in Mazepin and Mazepin's father's company as a sponsor. and they bring in Schumacher. This was never a great fit, but if they hadn't done that, we might have said, goodbye to the team. And now obviously world political events solved the problem of Mazepin and Mazepin's dad's company, being on the team, but they were left with Schumacher when they brought Magnussen back in. And it was very clear to me early on from the way they presented it that they weren't going to do a whole lot to make it easy for him.
And if you think about it as well, Chris, they had to bring in these two guys, Mazepin and Schumacher, because look, they put all their coins and all their money into one basket and all their eggs into one basket for 2022. And they actually started the season off on a good note. Q3, Magnussen qualifying in the top 10 in that car. And they had actually sort of a great plan there in that context. But where I don't think Mick fits the team is he's a very sort of nice personality, And I know people draw comparisons to his dad, Michael Schumacher, 7-time world champion, ruthless guy who would do anything to win a world championship. And Mick's coming in a context where he's just trying to get his feet wet in the sport. And he needs a sort of environment where he can make mistakes. I almost feel like Haas is probably one of the worst environments for him to be in, but he didn't really have any other options.
So one of the things I picked up during my time working in the world of junior single-seaters was that a lot of different teams take a lot of very different approaches in how they coach and develop their young drivers. And you can have the soft, nurturing touch where you have a lot of very open dialogue, and it's like, what do you need from us? And we can give that to you, and let's work this out. And for me, that has tended to be the more consistent approach that yields results over a long period of time. But then you would get these big spikes of performance from the teams that were very hard and very aggressive with their drivers. And that's the kind of management style that is going on at Haas. And it very much mirrors what Formula One kind of needs to be. Formula One's very cutthroat. There's not enough time to be lally-pallying around and giving a driver enough time to make mistakes and do all this, especially when Mick was destroying the car and not scoring points with it when he wasn't throwing it at walls, when it was very capable of scoring points. So to me, it's a no-brainer that he ended up on the sidelines this year.
I think his performances definitely weren't good enough, but you have to look into why his performances weren't good enough. And you just said there in regards to different styles of coaching, Chris, and it's in all forms of sport. And I think in particular, I don't think there's no really shimmering around it, or that Gunther Steiner has come across now as a poor manager, as a poor coach. He has a very particular hard style of coaching. And he was very dismissive of Mick Schumacher at the start of the season. Magnussen coming back into the fold was like it was the prodigal son had returned, and all their eggs were put into Magnussen's basket. There was no support and nurturing of Mick Schumacher. In essence, this is his rookie year, because him and Mazepin had a car that was languishing at the very back of the grid, just not doing anything. It was so horrible for them to drive. He had to be a very poor teammate, which he pretty much did 9 times out of 10. And I think overall for Mick Schumacher, I'm glad that he's out of that system now. And I do hope he gets another opportunity, because it will then be to salute to Gunther Steiner. But actually, do you know what? I was good enough. It was you that was the problem.
And I think that was perfectly wrapped up about everything I wanted to say on that topic. Matt, this is a guy who Haas has given up on because of crash damage and adding more pressure every time. He needs to be instilled with confidence, and he's a young guy. He's not as ruthless. He doesn't have that type of personality. He needs confidence. And as Scott said, he's with a team boss that just, I think, mismanaged sort of his driver there. And I know Mick didn't perform on the racetrack, but I also think he wasn't helped by the pressure that Gunther was giving him.
Right. So let's take issue with this. Do we all remember the footage from Silverstone where Mick scored points and almost passed Verstappen on track, albeit in an ailing Red Bull. Yeah, okay, that's the driver they could have had this season had they just bothered a little bit. But I'm going to disagree with you. I don't think it was mismanagement. I think they actively undermined him as a driver from the start. And I think if you look at Magnussen, who, let's all recall what happened to him at McLaren as a rookie. I think Magnussen picked up on it and did everything he could to help Schumacher. But Schumacher is young and he has an uncommonly soft brain. I understand this. I suffered with this syndrome too. So we see footage of push, Mick, push, Mick. Then what do you get? A crash. Did he really crash that much? No. Lots of drivers had more crashes than him. His crashes were very large and expensive. And that was used as an excuse to get rid of him. And I've seen it in the music world a lot, both at the extreme professional level. And I was told this story by someone who used to play in the Chicago Symphony. A conductor would just say, play softer until someone cracked a note and then you're fired. And then like in the conservatory level where they'd be like, oh, that sounds good. Play it again. So by the time they go play for someone, they've got no chops left at all. It's a very common thing. I think Schumacher was taken advantage of that way by overly trusting in that circumstance, his race engineer, and they used it to purposely get rid of him. But again, I say, look at Silverstone. That's a driver that reasonably should be on the grid and has some talent, even if it takes him a while to get there.
I think you're bang on in regards to the crashes being an excuse to get rid of him, but you have to look why those crashes came about, because he was given conflicting information the whole time. He's being told to push and that he's not going fast enough and that he's too slow. Then when he does, he's lacking that confidence already because of the budget cap, and he's probably been told behind closed doors to be careful. We can't do this. Saudi Arabia, that crash was a big one, and it was the second race of the season. So he's probably been told a telling off that, look, we can't afford for that to happen. Gunther Steiner, there's footage of him saying to Gene Haas, that's going to cost probably $1 million to $1.5 million. I mean, that's a substantial amount of money. But then throughout the season, he's questioning his engineer, going, well, can I push? How are the brakes? Because he's clearly been given a telling off behind closed doors that you can't be doing this. And then he's being told that, he's too slow and he needs to go faster and faster. So it's as a driver where confidence is so important and they're traveling at substantial speeds, what does he know what to do? Whereas Magnussen, it seems like, was, because he's the more experienced one, he's been told to, go out and do what needs to be done. And he has that previous experience of even working with Gunther Steiner and probably knowing how to handle the guys there.
Well, Chris, on that note, not only did he not have the confidence of Gunther Steiner, but as Scott said, Gene Haas was not, it sort of didn't help Mick Schumacher. And these conversations between Gunther and Gene behind the scenes, you could tell that Gene also didn't seem to be the biggest fan of Mick Schumacher.
Yeah, because Gene's the one paying for his damage. And in defense of Haas, I can understand why it's such a concern for them when they were one of, if not the only team, to be operating underneath the budget cap. Now, we have a different scenario now because they have the MoneyGram sponsorship and they've brought in a lot of new sponsors from North America as well. So that's not as much of an issue now. But they also have two much more experienced drivers who, well, in theory, won't be chucking it at the scenery quite so much. So I have a little bit of sympathy for the guy who writes the paychecks to the guy who keeps smashing up his car.
Matt?
And the thing I want to add to that, one is, I think, Steiner very much fanned that flame. But at the end of the day, as I discussed at the beginning of this was never a driver they really wanted to hire. They never wanted to hire rookies and train them. That was not the business plan. So I'm not surprised Haas didn't like him because that didn't fit with what he thought they were going to do in the first place. It was only out of necessity that they found themselves with Schumacher as one of their drivers.
And of course, the F word count from Gunther Steiner in this Drive to Survive series was probably at an absolute high as well. That had, if you were doing a world championship on that, Haas would win their first world championship. I'll tell you right now. What a series it was. This is our panel of guests, Matt, Chris, and Scott. Follow us all. I'm Jonathan Simon. We can follow us all on social media. Check the show notes, of course, for that. But for now, it's back to Spanners in the Shed.